All right. We'll let the last couple of people trickle in here. Can everybody hear me okay in the back? Yeah? These hand mics can be kind of hard sometimes. Hi. Got a few friends here. All right. So we'll get started here with adventures in Azure privilege escalation. Kind of surprised to see a full room here as somebody who's been pen testing Azure for a couple years. Kind of feel like nobody else is interested in it. Really nice to see a lot of other people interested in it. So a little bit about myself, Carl Fossen. I am a practice director at NetSpy, lead up our Pacific Northwest team out of the Portland, Oregon area. Done a lot of stuff over the years, password cracking, social engineering. You can find me on the NetSpy blog at blog.netspy.com. You can also find me on Twitter at @kfossen. And pretty much all my code goes under the NetSpy GitHub repo. And the specific tools that we'll talk about today during the talk will be under the microburst repo. If anyone wants a sticker as a reminder, we've got a handful of those up here as well. And as of Thursday this week, I'm now officially a private pilot. Passed my check ride, so. Thank you. Took only about a year. So, all right, so to get into it, kind of first things first, everybody's moving into the cloud, be it developers, sysadmins, infrastructure, even pen testers are starting to put their infrastructure and their resources and efforts up into the cloud. This could be Azure, AWS, Google, any of the million other cloud providers that are out there, but everybody's starting to move stuff up to the cloud. Along with that, we're reintroducing a lot of problems that we used to have in the past. A lot of the things you're going to see today and a lot of the themes are, I thought we solved that like 10 years ago. No, they're still problems that are coming back up from the past. So some of the reasons why people are specifically moving to Azure though, Azure AD, it integrates with Active Directory, super convenient, integrated for Active Directory users and groups. It's one-stop licensing, easy to integrate, easy to set up groups and all of that. So it's pretty easy to kind of forklift everything up into the cloud. So for the folks on the internet or watching later who want to pause right now to go check out these talks, these are some great primer talks that cover just some of the basics. We will be getting into a little bit more advanced topics today, but this is a good coverage of kind of basic stuff, advanced stuff, and I'm actually gonna have the slides tweeted out here after the talk. Just gotta connect to the internet and put them out on Twitter. So we'll give everybody at home a second to pause, go watch those, then come back. All right, welcome back. So moving forward, now that everybody's an Azure expert, we want to talk about initial entry points before we actually talk about escalating privileges, because primary focus of the talk is escalating privileges once you're already in that Azure subscription, but we need to get access first. Now, for those that may or may not know if they have Azure access already with their domain credentials, one thing that you can do is just go out to portal.azure.com, log in with your company email, Active Directory, anything like that, and you might actually find out that you have portal access. It's surprisingly common. Users get set up. A lot of things just don't get locked down initially. And what we're finding is we can either gather credentials online, guest credentials. We're saying goodbye to summer 2019 relatively soon here, but that's been really successful so far this year. And once we get those credentials, access either the portal or the CLI or any of the PowerShell commandlets, we then have access into that Azure subscription. Now, you could potentially go from the internal network to bypass MFA restrictions. We have seen it where external networks require MFA, but it's not actually required for the internal side of things. So depending on where you're at or what your kind of attack surface area is, you may be able to authenticate without MFA from the internal network. So keep that in mind. All right. So quick note about kind of the permissions model. If anybody's ever tried to unpack the permission and privilege model within Azure, it's a little complicated. You've got your kind of high level of tenant. So your tenant in Azure, we'll think of that as kind of the enterprise level. And underneath that, you've got individual subscriptions. So those subscriptions are kind of like your domains or subdomains. And underneath those subscriptions, you've got specific resources, resource groups, anything that you would want to spin up as a service. So at the tenant level, we've got a number of different roles that can apply. The primary one that we're going to be concerned about today is global admin. We'll talk about user admin a little bit, and there's probably 15, 20 other roles that are now available up in Azure that you can apply to specific Azure AD accounts. But for today, we're going to focus and care about global admin because that's the account that really controls the full tenant. At the subscription level, so just under the tenant level, you can have owners who own that subscription. They can actually control access to resources, give access to people, have full rights to everything that's in that specific subscription. What we do frequently find is that owners of one subscription might be a privileged account already and might have access to other subscriptions, but we're going to talk about that when we get into the owner level of the privilege escalation. Contributors have rights to do a lot of things, make changes, they just can't delegate access out to other users. Readers are basically just that. They can read information from the subscription, not really make any changes, not anything super impactful. So keep those three, owner, contributor, reader, in your mind when we're talking about individual subscriptions. There's a number of special kind of custom roles, already touched on them a little bit. They're typically service or application specific, so it may apply to a specific app services or key vaults or anything like that within Azure, and those are applied kind of on a per user basis. And we're not going to cover a lot of those. There's some interesting permissions that could potentially be abused in each of those roles, but we just don't have time to cover that today. So in terms of applying each of these roles, we talked about owner, contributor, reader. That's really kind of at the subscription level. It can also be applied down to resource group and the individual asset layer. So if you have contributor rights to a single virtual machine, there's some stuff that you can do there that we'll cover later. So quick note about just kind of listing your permissions. We're not going to go through each of these, but here's some of the AZ commands that you can use to list out owners, readers, contributors, etc. What I'd recommend if you're just diving into this initially is go out to the Azure portal, either create a new subscription under your own domain, play around with it. They've got a $200 month-long trial that is actually really handy to learn a lot of this stuff. But go to the portal, go to your subscriptions, and then go to the IAM section. You can see who's contributor, owner, all of that stuff there. Likewise, if you're getting somebody's credentials and you want to log in through the portal, that's an easy way to enumerate where you're at with that subscription. Likewise, with Azure Active Directory, if you go into the Azure Active Directory tab within the Azure portal, you can just go roles and administrators and list out global admins right there, which might give you some good targets to go after. So kind of overall privilege overview that we're going to follow through this presentation is starting with basically no Azure access. We'll cover that in a couple of slides, but basically you can log in, but you can't really see a whole lot. There are some other things you can do, but you're a little bit limited. Working our way up all the way through tenant/global admin and learning stuff along the way. So initially, let's say that you have basically no Azure access. You take your domain creds that you've guessed or gathered from somewhere, you log into the portal, but there's nothing really there. You can log in and it's valid creds and you can't see any resources. You might be able to go into Azure Active Directory and list out the users, but you don't have a subscription applied to you. So the positives, you do have valid creds, and you could potentially pivot out to other services. My recommendation here would be go out to myapps.microsoft.com. It's a nice place to go to list out all of the federated SSO endpoints that you can log into from that point. You may not have full access to Azure things, but you may be able to pivot out to Office 365 and start going through mailboxes or SharePoint or other services that are available. Additionally, you might be able to access accounting apps, Salesforce, GitHub, all sorts of other federated authentications that may be available through myapps.microsoft.com. Negatives, there's not a lot of valuable information that we can pull out if you don't have a subscription assigned. So we're just going to kind of go past this no Azure access and assume that you've got an account that at least has reader rights on the subscription. All right. So with reader rights, this may sound kind of dumb, but this actually really works. Once you have reader rights and can read out all of the users from Azure Active Directory, let's say that you started with OSINT, you gathered a list of email addresses that you brute force that initial summer 2019 cred with. You want a full list of actual real emails that you can use against the portal. We'll just go ahead, log in, dump out Azure AD, and get a full list of email addresses that are legitimate, that you know work. I've had this work with great success. Literally the easiest escalation I've ever had on a cloud pen test was logged in with reader rights, listed out all the users, specifically focused on the global admins users. company used a very common password for a lot of their accounts. It just happened that 3 of their 10 global admins all shared the same password, and there was no MFA. So we got global admin with 3 different accounts in the span of maybe 5 minutes of having access to the account. So super handy, easiest escalation ever. Definitely enable MFA for everybody. It's really not that hard with Azure. And once you have it enabled, it really helps slow an attacker down. If anybody wants to see a cool bypass for MFA with Azure, check out Dirk Jan's talk at Defcon this year. Did kind of a funny, cool thing with the phone-based authentication. Worth a look at that. Let's see here. So one of the other things to kind of note here is that with those global admin accounts and tenant accounts, the accounts that we guessed those credentials for had access to probably 20, 30 different subscriptions that accounted for thousands upon thousands of dollars of Azure bills per month. And the potential impact of having access to one of those global admin accounts could be massive. You could just go in, start deleting resources, shut everything down, cancel subscriptions. And if there's no MFA and any attacker can guess those credentials, that could be really serious. All right, so if there's one really important thing that I want everybody to take out of this and potentially try with their own subscriptions, is that the deployment parameters that are used to deploy resources in Azure can frequently be misconfigured to store clear text credentials. So when we have reader writes into a subscription, what we do is list out all of the resource groups, which is really how you kind of group different resources to manage billing, manage access, all of that. List out all of the resource groups that are available to you, pipe those into the Git resource group deployment, and just out that to a text file. In there, you're probably going to find at least 1 or 2 clear text credentials. We're finding this on, I'd say, upwards of 80% of the cloud pen tests that we do, where we get access to Azure as a reader. Pretty much a guarantee that at some point in time, somebody was trying to figure out how the deployment templates worked, forgot to set that admin password that we have highlighted up there as a secure string, and that ended up in clear text in those deployment logs, and anybody can read that out. So in this case, we had a virtual machine scale set that we spun up. Admin username was azadmin. I purposefully set the password to a clear text string, as is this clear text with a question mark, and that got stored into that deployments file. Super handy. Like I said, we've gotten local admin creds for all the virtual machines before for this because, like I said, problems from 10 years ago keep coming back. Shared local admin on a gold image, and they're not using laps or any other solutions to set different passwords. As soon as you get that credential, you've got local admin across all of the VMs up in Azure. So this one's a little less common, but we occasionally see it with developers with reader access. If a reader account has access to app services, which is basically Azure's way of spinning up web services up in the Azure cloud, you could potentially read out connection strings for Azure SQL and or Microsoft SQL, depending on what they're connecting to. So maybe they've got a virtual machine that has SQL going on a virtual machine or some server back over a direct connect or VPN. Scott's here. He writes PowerUp SQL. Check out PowerUp SQL to attack SQL databases. It's an awesome tool and super handy for pivoting and escalating privileges that way. So along with those connection strings, we also see application deployment passwords. So if you want to go ahead and get access to that application source code, the app services are hosted publicly through a secure FTP site that you could just log in and dump the code from. So if you're able to gather those credentials for that, you might be able to get access to the source code, maybe backdoor the application, run your own stuff, add a web shell, all sorts of fun stuff there. All right, so kind of wraps up some of the basics of a reader, but we'll just give you a quick escalation example that we'll walk through as we continue the escalation path here. But starting with a reader level account, we guessed external credentials, we'll say summer 2019, got access to the portal. That user has subscription level reader rights, not just individual resources or resource groups at the subscription level. We're able to read out all of the deployment parameters for all the resource groups, grabbed a local admin credential for a domain joined virtual machine. And what we do find is a lot of these environments kind of snowball over time. So somebody decides, oh, we're going to put this application up in Azure, and they start trying to figure things out, and things are misconfigured initially, and eventually, well, they get things working right, and they never fix that misconfiguration. So all of a sudden, you get a virtual machine that's exposed out to the internet, has RDP available, and we can log right in with those creds. So that's what we'll do. And surprising, more often than not, that dev environment just gets marked as prod and becomes the prod Azure environment. So we've got local admin. Let's say that we Mimikatz out a contributor level account, because this is tied to the Active Directory. You've got multiple people logging into this web server or whatever that virtual machine is, and we now have a contributor account. Sounds kind of like a pretty standard escalation from a network pen test perspective, but now we have contributor, and there's a lot more fun stuff we can do with contributor. So one thing to note here, just kind of as we talk about exposing stuff out to the internet, say RDP or SSH, I have run into it where databases are exposed from the entire IPv4 space. So they'll put in an IP exception for all zeros dash all 255s. So anybody anywhere can potentially try to log into an Azure SQL database. Kind of similar for virtual machines. I've seen NSG rules applied for specific Azure regions. So the people that were setting up the environment thought, okay, well, we're going to have stuff in different regions and we want it to be able to talk to each other. We need to open up firewall ports between the different regions. In this case, that was kind of a bad idea, because what they ended up doing is just opening up all ports to all of the regions. So they imported each of the IP regions. So from the NetSpy IP address, we couldn't see a whole lot. We just did quick nmap. Didn't really see a whole lot. Fired up a virtual machine in Azure, scanned those same IP address ranges, and literally saw everything. So something to watch out for when you're taking a look at NSG rules. So yay, contributor access. So there's kind of different flavors of this. If we've got subscription level contributor access, this is great. We've got contributor to pretty much everything in the subscription. There's a lot we can work with there. If it's individual resource groups, that's not bad. There may be some resources that we can make use of to help escalate. If it's just a single resource, like a virtual machine, we'll see. You might be able to escalate out of that, but it's pretty rare that we see that. Honestly, from a permissions perspective, it's pretty rare for us to see something outside of subscription level IAM policies. It's pretty rare that we see somebody actually get granular and get down to individual resources, much less resource groups. So another really important, we'll call the second most important thing to remember from this, is that if you have contributor level access on a virtual machine, you are local system. So this is hugely impactful if you get contributor level access, because at that point, you've got system on all of the VMs. I wrote a blog post that's down at the bottom here that covers some techniques that we can do. I wrapped some PowerShell code around some of the Azure RM commandlets to execute code on virtual machines. So let's say you want to run invoke Mimikatz on every single one of the virtual machines. You can queue that up through PowerShell. Wouldn't really recommend it. Pretty good chance you'll get caught by some kind of AV or EDR at some point doing that. But if you want to add a local admin or do something else on all of the virtual machines, if you've got contributor level access to that subscription, you can easily do that. A number of different things that you can kind of run through that command execution, but I'd highly recommend that as a next step if you want to pivot into the virtual machines and potentially pivot back into, say, an internal network. One of the things that we have seen a few times is an environment that's kind of blended with sysadmins and devs. So sysadmins set up the Azure cloud, started adding developers into that subscription, and then you get a little bit of a mix-up of whose resources are where and where do they belong. So say the sysadmins want a backup domain controller out in the cloud. Okay, good for redundancy, all that. But the developers need contributor rights to manage, say, a web app that they're putting together on a virtual machine out in the cloud. Well, those contributors who are devs shouldn't have rights to take over a domain controller, but since they have contributor rights on all of the virtual machines in the subscription, that domain controller is now a backup in the cloud. Those devs now have contributor level access, local system on the DC, and you can kind of see where that's going from there. So definitely a problem that we occasionally see. Just recommendation there, just separate your environments. It's easy to spin up another subscription under the overall tenant and just kind of keep things clean and separate. So we'll talk about storage accounts next. If anybody's familiar with storage accounts, it's Microsoft's way of storing files, data tables, all that kind of stuff. Primary thing that we run into with cloud pen tests or getting into Azure environments is really just publicly available containers and files, config files that end up in the storage accounts or in the blob storage. One thing that we frequently find are config files that are stored in storage accounts, which as a contributor, you have rights to go ahead and download those individual files. Those config files get pulled into build pipelines, active systems that need a config file exposed out to Azure. Lots of great passwords, keys, all sorts of good things that we can start attacking from there. So I'd say kind of next step, take a look at available storage accounts and start piling through the containers and files. With reader level access, you can read the actual names of the storage accounts and the containers, but not necessarily the files underneath that. So if anything is publicly available, there are ways that you can basically list out container permission containers and list out all the files there as a reader, but it's not as practical. We occasionally see publicly exposed, really sensitive data, say config files, passwords, et cetera, but not quite as frequently. One other option, if they're hosting Office documents up on blob storage or anything like that, you might want to try backdooring those Office documents, anything like that. But at that point, you could bounce out SharePoint, do the same kind of thing. One thing that we've also found working with storage accounts for phishing, red teams, all that kind of stuff, is using storage accounts and blob storage to actually host payloads and malicious content. Because storage accounts don't really care whatever you put in there, and the blob storage URL is typically a trusted URL because it goes through a Windows domain. So if you want a nice safe place to host some of your payloads, take a look at blob storage. All right, so contributor level access on virtual disks, virtual hard drives. We frequently see backups of hard drive images or VHD files out in blob storage and publicly available so we can download them. The problem is that they're usually like 120 gigs and they take a while to download. You potentially mount them into another Azure resource and it makes it a little bit quicker to load those things up versus downloading them over your standard internet connection. But if you've got access to the actual virtual disk, you could potentially make a copy of that disk and then parse things off of it. In the talk I did last year, I talked about downloading a VHD file that was publicly available, scraping out the hashes, and getting access to that virtual machine from there. But Static Flow put out a very similar attack for AWS. Check out that blog post and the associated code for basically the AWS equivalent. It's pretty similar to do same process for Azure. So if you have contributor level access to key vaults or app services and automation accounts, there are a lot of passwords that hang out in those three areas. Key vaults, it would make sense. It's a key vault. That's where passwords should go. But if you have contributor level access and specific permissions to the key vaults, I wrote Git Azure Passwords. It's out of the Microburst repo. Basically goes through all of the key vault entries and tries to dump all of them. It's not the most OPSEC safe thing. We have seen alerts pop up saying, hey, this user's not authorized to access these key vaults. They tried to access these key vaults. We got alerts. So I'd definitely be careful with that. But if you have a contributor account that has read access on those key vault entries, definitely go ahead and dump those out, see what's available there. App services, we kind of talked through those available credentials, but what Git Azure Passwords does, pulls out all of the connection strings as well as the deployment passwords that are available and lists those out in the output there. Finally, for automation accounts, and we're going to spend a decent chunk of time talking about automation accounts today, but automation accounts frequently are set up as contributor accounts on the subscription by default. When you create a new automation account, it creates an application account in Azure AD, and you can go ahead and use that to run contributor level rights code in these automation runbooks. So automation is kind of the serverless code automation within Azure. You can go ahead and do PowerShell, Python. They have a graphical runbook that you can run too. It's really a great way to just automate a lot of the workflow that you have in Azure. But it's also a great way to potentially escalate privileges, persist. We'll talk about that in a couple of slides here. But from an automation account perspective, people may want to contribute put in secondary credentials instead of that contributor service account that's running as the automation account to do, let's say, user administration. So we've seen automation accounts that are set up with global admin credentials, and we're able to pull those out in clear text because of the way that they're stored. So in order to make use of those credentials, the automation account actually stores the credential in a reversible format that you can pull out with an automation runbook. So what Get Azure Passwords does is actually creates a new runbook with that automation account, dumps out the available credentials that are stored in the credentials, and it can also dump out any configured run as certificates, and those can actually be used after the fact to authenticate back to that automation account. So those can actually be really handy for persistence. All right. So with the runbooks, we found that they're actually frequently configured to have key vault access. So the runbooks will do some type of automation that requires them to, say, pull a local admin password out of the key vault instead of storing it in a deployment template or somewhere else clear text. So what we can do with those automation accounts, I put another blog post out probably a couple months ago that talks about using these automation accounts to go ahead and dump out all of the key vault entries so that you can see what's in there. Since your regular contributor account may not have rights to read that key vault, but that automation account does, you could just run code in that Azure runbook or that automation account to go ahead and just dump everything out of the key vaults. Super handy. Just a nice way to kind of bypass or make use of those contributor accounts to then get access to the actual key vaults. And without owner permissions, you can't actually assign yourself to it, so it's good bypass for that. In terms of escalating privileges, like I said, we have seen it where owner level accounts or tenant admin, global admin accounts are being configured as the clear text credentials. So potentially you can either just use those within the runbooks and create your own new user or escalate privileges of another user up to tenant admin and then log in. Those tenant admin accounts may be protected with MFA, so they may have kind of runbook permissions set up so that you could actually execute code as a tenant admin or global admin and start doing admin things from there. So sky's the limit there. At that point, you have access to that account, basically. And we'll kind of cover that in the persistence section as well. So continuing our reader level example, we Mimikatz that contributor account logged in to Azure Portal or CLI or whatever with this new contributor account. Have contributor level access to automation accounts. And from there, we ran the get passwords to dump out the credentials. Turns out there's an owner account configured for the credentials for automation accounts. Like I said, we do frequently see this because automation accounts will get set up. Somebody realizes, I can't do the things I want to do. I better just give it my own credentials so it runs as me because I know my credentials will work. And then those credentials get stored in there and then we get access to them. So at this point, we've got owner. So this is where things get a little complicated because quite frequently we find tenant admin credentials in some way, shape, or form during that contributor phase. We don't typically spend a lot of time in that owner phase because we frequently just jump right up to tenant admin from contributor. But if you do have owner level access, as I mentioned before, typically these are kind of privileged accounts in the first place. They have ownership rights on the subscription and they're frequently configured with multiple subscriptions. So do yourself a favor and use, say, the AZ commandlets to list out all of the available subscriptions for that account. And then you can just jump into the other subscriptions from there. Or if you go to the top right-hand corner and click on your account and then switch your subscription under directory and subscriptions, you can just list out the other subscriptions that are available that we have in the bottom right there. So once you have owner level access, my best recommendation here is really just bouncing from subscription to subscription. Let's say that you ended up in the prod environment up front. They have that relatively locked down. You're able to escalate up to owner. That owner probably owns the dev environment as well. And I don't want to make any promises, but that dev environment is probably not as locked down. And there's probably a lot more credentials and other things that you can use to pivot going through that dev environment instead. So definitely look at other subscriptions as potential to escalate. Really just lather, rinse, repeat until you've accessed or owned all of the other subscriptions. Let's say you pivot into that dev environment, get another owner credential who then has access to a couple more subscriptions. At a certain point, you've got enough owner credentials to have owner rights on all of the subscriptions. Now, it's not full tenant admin at that point, but you basically control the whole tenant at that point. So we'll get up to tenant admin and persistence here. So you've got global admin. Now what do you want to do? Well, you could burn it all down. That would be bad. But with some of the organizations that we deal with, they're using thousands upon thousands of dollars of Azure resources per month, and this could be hugely impactful. So talking about potential impact, if you took down the entirety of your Azure infrastructure, how would that impact your organization? That could be hugely impactful. So A, we don't want to burn it all down. That's not something we're going to do. But we may want to pivot internally. So if we've got access to all of these subscriptions, we own Azure AD, we can create our own accounts, get access to everything else. There's a pretty good chance that there's a direct connect tunnel back to the corporate network. We can get access to, say, a virtual machine, and then start pivoting back over that VPN or direct connection back into the corporate environment and start going after the resources we want there. And from an external pen test perspective, if we're guessing credentials externally, getting access to VMs through the portal or through these escalations, there's a pretty good chance that we could then pivot into the internal network from there. So we also want to persist our access. So depending on what the scope of the engagement is, you may want to hang out and have tenant admin access for a while. If your operation's going for a while, you may want to persist your access. So we'll talk about a couple of techniques for that. So first thing, it's kind of allowed to add accounts. Wouldn't highly recommend it, but it is an option. You could add Azure AD accounts that could be added to the global admins group or add a user admins group. Be a little quieter, it might not be as monitored, but if monitoring's set up for additions to these protected groups, there's a pretty good chance you might get caught there. But that would be kind of a secondary way so that if your primary account gets you locked out or if you somehow lose access, you have some backup there. Recommendations there follow company naming structure. If it's first initial, last name, or say Carl.Fossen, that kind of structure, use a similar username. And if you want to be a little more quiet, add that as a contributor or maybe even an owner for the important subscriptions that you want to get back into to potentially pivot and escalate your access again. Try and mimic the account attributes of the other admins. It's really easy to go into Azure AD and just pick out all of the attributes for specific users. If they're not using a specific field or comment, maybe you don't want to use that when you're creating that user. So kind of a fun little AZ CLI command that I have up here. First one here lists out all of your subscriptions. So let's say that you've created a new user, we'll call it NetSpy, and you want to add NetSpy as an owner of all of these subscriptions in the tenant. Well, you can just list out with AZ account list, pipe it out through some convert from JSON, grab out the IDs, pipe those IDs into the create role for owner for the NetSpy user, and then just pipe in those IDs for that. Basically, you could make that into a one-liner and give yourself owner-level access for a specific account really quickly. All right, additional kind of add user type option that we have, and this has been talked about by a few other people before, but wanted to touch on it, is guest access to a tenant. So if you have external collaboration settings set up to allow guest users, you can invite somebody's Gmail address or maybe create a lookalike email domain. So if we compromise the NetSpy cloud, netspy.cloud seems like it might be legitimate, like it might have been set up for the Azure environment. So if you create a lookalike email domain, create a user within that, you get an invite email, then start adding that user to different groups that you want to maintain access to. I will say the guest accounts don't seem to get audited a whole lot. We take a look at those when we do cloud pen tests to kind of see how many guest accounts are existing in that Azure tenant, and we frequently see a lot. They can be set up for external collaboration. I'd say for the most part, they're not set up with excessive user permissions, but let's say you use outsourced IT for some of your work or some of your vendors. They may actually have somewhat excessive permissions, and that could be a large risk to you having those guest accounts on your Azure tenant. So if you want to add a guest account to the tenant, might be a useful thing to do. Just add appropriate IAM assessment or assignments where you need them. Just persist your access that way. I don't really recommend this one, but I came up with this Bender picture and really wanted to use it. You could create your own subscription. You your tenant admin. You could create your own and fill it with blackjack and crypto miners. This is more of a malicious attacker kind of perspective. If somebody gets your tenant admin or global admin credentials and wants to start doing crypto mining, yeah, they can go ahead and do that. They can spin up a whole bunch of virtual machines and incur a whole bunch of costs on your Azure subscription. As practical pen testers or red teamers, I wouldn't recommend this. It's not going to look good. But as an actual attack that people should be concerned about, definitely look out for people spinning up those subscriptions. So a little more quieter option, and this will lead us more into the automation accounts and keeping persistence through that, is creating service principals, applications, or automation accounts and giving them excessive privileges. So Azure AD has a number of different ways that you can create accounts. You can create regular user accounts that are like any other AD user account. And you can also create applications. And what you'll see with automation accounts is, let's call it backup. What you'll see with the backup automation account is there is an application user that's created in Azure AD. You can go to it through the Azure AD portal and list out all of the enrolled applications. And you'll see backup and then a bunch of base64 after it. Those all kind of blend in. They look like service accounts. If you want to create your own within there and kind of persist and hide in those are pretty handy because they're less likely to be taken away. If it says backup process, you're less likely to delete that outright. Probably want to investigate that a little bit deeper, may buy you a little bit more time within your actual pen test. So with automation accounts, like I said, automation accounts create these application accounts in Azure AD, and then you can go ahead and apply specific rights to them. So I've got a blog post coming out next week that'll kind of discuss some of this and provide some example code that you can make use of. But let's say that you create an automation account, give it a bunch of excessive permissions, and use that as your long-term persistence. You can go ahead and add a runbook, use that runbook to run the code that you want, and it runs with the rights of that specific automation account. So let's say you want to create a new Azure AD user. You can use that new user as kind of short-term access, and then use this automation account as kind of your long-haul, long-term access, and then just burn off new AD users that you create, because this automation account's probably going to persist a little bit longer. You could potentially set up runbooks that just add a user back to the admins group, or pick a specific existing user that you have credentials for, and then make a runbook that just keeps giving them more permissions. One kind of funny thing that we'll kind of see throughout the rest of these slides here is sometimes the Azure portal's a little weird. It doesn't always delete things immediately. You may say, hey, let's delete this virtual machine, and then 20 minutes later, it's not gone yet. Occasionally, it hiccups a little bit. Stuff like that happens. I think your average Azure admin's going to look at it and go, well, I thought I tried to delete that user. I don't know why it's not gone yet, but I guess I'll try it again and delete it again. If you have a runbook set up to just re-add that user every time that it gets deleted, it's just going to kind of look like, oh, well, it just hasn't deleted yet, or I thought I deleted it. For some reason, it's not gone. Additionally, with automation accounts, I mean, if you're contributor level access, you've got local system on all the virtual machines, so you can go ahead and create a runbook that runs your payload on all of the virtual machines. So if you want to keep C2 channels open through virtual machines, anything like that, you can set up a runbook to do all of that. One other option I haven't really made use of, but thought might be kind of handy, is dumping any current Azure information out to a storage blob that you control, or something that might be public for purpose of a pen test. Probably give it a key for a storage account that you own for the blob storage. And let's say you just want to keep a running list of all of the current users in Azure Active Directory. You can set up a runbook to just dump all of those out and write them out to a storage account that you own and just exfiltrate data that way. So that can be kind of handy. So one way that you can make use of these, particularly if you lose your access, is using webhooks. I really like these. So with the automation accounts and the runbooks, you can set up a webhook that you can make a post request out to, and it runs the runbook. So in this case that we have here, we have a runbook that's running in an automation account that's been set up with user admin rights, along with subscription ownership rights on the subscription it's in. And then that runbook goes in, creates a new user that you supply through this post request with the password that you supply, and then adds it as an owner on the account. So what we see here is we've got a nice URL that we can make the post request to. We see the code here. Like I said, the blog will be coming out next week with the sample runbook for this. And I've actually pushed out some of that code to the microburst repo if anybody wants to check it out. But the blog that helps explain that will be out next week. So we got a little demo here. Blog demo user is our username. Password's password123, really secure. But all I did was hit F5. It invoked the web request, and we're going to log in Azure RM account. It's going to pop login right here. We'll put in that blog demo user, prompts for the password, password123. Hey, we authenticated. Awesome. So it actually makes you change your password on first login, so we know that this was a newly created user. Give it a stronger password than password123, because it does filter on words like password or admin. And now we're logged in. So we've now created, from this single post request, an owner account that now is a backdoor back into the environment. And like I said, this automation account just kind of stays our long haul. We can create new users as need be. You know, if these users get caught and get removed, we still have this automation account that just kind of hides in the background in those application accounts. So super handy. All right, other thing that I wanted to cover here with the runbooks is watchers. Now this is something I want to dive deeper into. I haven't written the automation around this yet, but kind of a couple ideas that could be used here. So the watchers for automation accounts or runbooks are basically runbooks that run every X number of minutes. So you could set up one that checks if an Azure AD user is removed. Okay, so I created my NetSpy global admin, and I've created an excessive permissioned automation account that checks to see if NetSpy has been deleted. So if NetSpy has been deleted, we go ahead and just run another runbook that's in that same automation account, add NetSpy back, and just keep doing that every time it gets deleted. There's a chance that it may just look like, oh, Azure Portal's not working right now. It's not able to delete something from Azure AD. Kind of annoying. I'll deal with it later. Hopefully it buys you a little bit more time. Another idea with that is kind of a, I guess I'm calling it a double dead man switch. So if one of the automation accounts gets deleted, you have a secondary automation account set up with runbooks to create another copy of that automation account. They just go back and forth watching each other, because let's say somebody's investigating it. It's like, oh, it looks like this automation account for some reason is excessively permissioned, and it's, you know, giving access to all these people. It's creating users. We need to delete this and shut this thing down. Okay, well, it's gone. You've got a second automation account that just goes back and recreates that. And as the IR team's going and investigating the second automation account, your first one's sitting there watching the second one, waiting for it to get deleted. And if it gets deleted, it just goes back and adds it again. So you get this continuous circle of kind of a double dead man switch. Haven't written that methodology up yet, but just kind of came up with that like last week and wanted to make sure that made it into the slides. So the watchers are pretty cool. It's a nice way to just automate some of the persistence instead of relying on those webhooks. So kind of a slightly loud option here, but adding backdoors to VMs. We talked about that with the code execution a little bit, like even adding a local admin, opening up firewall rules. Once you have tenant admin, there's a lot that you can do. If you want to open up RDP to your IP addresses, you can do that. Just give yourself, you know, remote access at that point. Modifying build templates, Docker images, all that kind of stuff. There could be some major changes to the environment. So try to avoid major state changes in general, but these are slightly louder persistence options that may be an option for you. So we're running up on time here. Any questions? Yep.
So I have a question around the ability to clone hard drive. Can you clone into a different Azure subscription altogether in a different tenant?
So the question was, can you clone hard drives into a different Azure subscription or different container? My recommendation would be make the backup of the image and copy that backup over to another storage account that you own, and then you could do that. Any other questions? Yep, up front. So the question was around Azure AD and kind of syncing that back to on-prem networks and exploring that a little bit. I would highly recommend checking out Derbycon's talk from DEF CON. He covers a lot of that stuff there. I've gotten a little bit into that, but he covers it a lot better than I could right now. Any other questions? Yep. Was the question, have I come across PIM? Not really. I will say with a lot of our clients that are making use of Azure, they're just starting to move applications in. So it's setting up virtual machines, setting up SQL servers, just real basics of using Azure. And really starting to harden things has not been a super large priority. Yep.
When you were talking about the goals you're going after, have you ever considered or have you ever seen environments where you attack user access administrator?
So the question was around attacking user access administrator role? Yep. So that is one of the specific accounts I usually go after, doing password guessing or looking for specific sessions or users to specifically target. User access administrators or global admins are really kind of the key for escalation and trying to pivot through Azure AD. Any other questions? Okay, I don't see any hands here. I do have a bunch of microburst stickers over here if anybody wants any. I'll be around here answering questions, so feel free to say hi. Thank you.